that's one thing. The other thing about inflation in developing countries, in the cases that you mentioned, it's usually the case of external inflation that's imported when you import food or fuel or whatever resources a particular country has. So when you look at most developing countries, you realize that the reason they lose their monetary sovereignty is because they have structural economic issues, structural deficit issues, trade deficit issues, I should specify. And when you zoom in most countries, those tend to be two reasons. One is a deficit related to food imports. They just don't have enough, food production domestically, so they have to import food on a systemic basis. And number two, it's an energy or fuel trade deficit related. So they have to import fuel to fuel their economy. And those are things that, no matter what you do as a central bank, you're not going to, eliminate those structural issues unless, as a country, you start investing in renewable energy so that you don't have to import fossil fuels anymore, or you invest in a sustainable agricultural policy so that you have food self-sufficiency. So if you have that kind of hole in your trade deficit every single year, if you don't borrow in a foreign currency as a developing country, if you don't borrow in dollars or euros, what's going to happen is that your exchange rate is going to depreciate. And then the next morning or the next month, when you as a country try to import food or fuel, you're going to import it at a higher price. So you'll be importing inflation into your domestic economy. Essentially, you'll be calling for food riots and fuel riots and social and political instability right away. And that's what you see in a lot of these cases. The inflation is related to a weakness of the productive capacity of the domestic system, plus the imported inflation that happens because of a depreciation of the exchange rate. And none of this is relevant to the US, obviously, because we don't deal with those issues. So instead of dealing with the hyperinflation and inflation, instead of dealing with the lack of domestic fuel and domestic food production, central banks in those developing countries end up issuing bonds denominated in dollars or euros or Japanese yen in order to keep the exchange rate artificially stable, in order to prevent the country from importing inflation. And that becomes a permanent trap for those countries, a permanent debt trap. And so the debt of developing countries is very different than the US national debt or the Japanese national debt, because the US debt is denominated in dollars, the Japanese debt is 100% denominated in Japanese yen. But you look at a country like Tunisia or Egypt or any of the many developing countries, their debt is typically denominated both partially in their domestic currency, but the big problem is the debt that's denominated in foreign currencies. And that's the structural debt trap that they have.